Hi, welcome to the channel. I'm Lauro Miller and make videos about programming. This is the second video about control flow structures in JavaScript, and today we're going to talk about loops. We'll talk about the main structures used for loops and also the main use cases for each of them. So let's switch Notion and let's get started. In this part, we're going to cover the four main constructs that we use for loops. And these are the for loops, the for off loops, the while loops, and the do while loops. New file here, and that's going to be for.js. Now, for loops have the following syntax. They have an initialization phase. I'm sorry for the warnings here. I will remove them, or actually maybe I can just put the whole thing between two or between a multi-line comment so that I can comment on it before actually implementing the code. So we have an initialization phase, we have a condition phase, and then we have a post-execution phase. Okay, and then here we have the actual loop block or code block, right? So this code block is going to be executed. So the order is that we will initialize whatever is in here, whatever variables or anything that's in here. Then we will check the condition. If the condition evaluates to true, we are going to execute this code block once, and then we'll execute the post-execution statements. And then we check the condition again. If the condition is true, then we will execute the code block once again. We will keep executing the code block and the post-execution commands until the condition evaluates to false. If the condition never evaluates to false, we're going to enter into an infinite loop, and this is going to cause some pretty bad things in our program, meaning it's going to get stuck. And that's not what we want, right? So we want to avoid infinite loops, except for programs which need to be running continuously. For example, if they are listening for some events or for some input from outside, then the program needs to remain being executed. And one way of doing that would be with a while loop. For example, it executes until the user provides a certain command, a certain combination of keys that then breaks out of the loop. Now, this more complex, more advanced applications of infinite loops we're going to skip for now. We will just stay with the vanilla implementation, and for the vanilla implementation, we would always like the loop to come to an end. Okay, so for loops, let's let's create a very simple for loop, and we are going to initialize some counter here. Let's be a little bit more verbose. For let counter equals to 0, we are going to see if counter is less than 10. Then execute something, and then in the end of our loop execution, increment the counter by 1. And then what we're going to do here, I will just say console.log counter. Okay, that's perhaps the simplest loop that you can think of. And I'll save this back here in the console. Let's run node for.js. And then as you see, it just prints from 0 to 9. The only required part of this whole declaration here is actually the condition. Okay, if you wanted to actually write something like this, let counter equals 0, and then omit this first part, this is also fine. I will save this, I'll run the code, it's going to output exactly the same thing. And even if you wanted to omit this, that's also fine. You can just put the counter here within the loop, right? So this would be kind of a while loop. We'll explore this in a bit, but the constructs are very similar. If I save this and I execute, I'll also get the same output. Now, personally speaking, I don't think this is a good practice to omit either of them. I prefer to actually put the whole thing within the loop initialization. So that's what I prefer here. And then the counter I'm going to delete. And here I can also say counter plus plus. And that is because it becomes much easier to understand which variables are actually involved in the loop, right? If I initialize things outside of the loop, and if I perform some update within the loop, then I need to do some additional mental effort to actually put the loop together. So to bring all the pieces of the loop together and make sense of what actually is happening, right? So I want to avoid that. And that's why I prefer to initialize everything, or actually to use all the three elements of this for loop. That's it for loops. Of course, that's a very brief introduction. We will come back to more complex applications later on, probably in other series when we talk about more applied JavaScript knowledge, or actually TypeScript knowledge. But for now, it's important for us to know that such a construct exists, and which are the perhaps, let's say, quote unquote, best practice when it comes to using it. Let's discuss for off loops, and for off loops are a special construct that we can use to go through the values or to iterate through the values of any iterable in JavaScript. So what is an iterable? We're going to discuss that at a later point in time. For now, let's just think any object that has a series of values to it, right? So an array is an iterable, a map is an iterable, a set is an iterable, or any object that implements the iterable interface is actually an iterable and we can go through its elements by using this for off loop. So let's stick to the array here. We're going to stick to a simple example. Let's say we have a couple of elements, 1A, 2, and then we'll say an object here, name John. Of course, I'm giving you an example of something that would not be implemented in practice, because in practice you would like to have a well-defined type of object or types so either an array of all primitive values, and then you have a very specific subset of these primitive values, or an array of objects and you have all the objects of roughly the same shape. But for this example here, we don't need to worry about that. In any case, we can actually iterate over this by using a normal for loop, right? So we can say let counter equals to 0 while the counter is less than the length of the array, and then at the end of the loop we want to increment the counter, and there is a little typo here, sorry for that. And here we can simply console.log array at position counter and position counter, right? So no problem here if I save this and I come back to the console and I run node for off, then this should output 1A2 and name John. That's no problem. This is one way we can do that. But another more concise way is to actually use this for off loop. And the for off loop, it starts by assigning a certain element of the array to a certain variable. So if we declare it like this, const element of array, then at each iteration, it's going to create a new fresh binding to this element variable. And this is going to be each of the elements of the array one at a time, right? So it starts at index 0. And then for the first iteration, it's going to have in the element here, it's going to have the number 1. Once this iteration is over, then it advances 1 in the index, and then in the next iteration of this for loop, we're going to have A as the element, and so on and so forth. Now you may be wondering, okay, isn't this violating the principle behind declaring a variable with const? And not really, because what this is actually doing is something like this. So for here, I'm not going to use the off loop, the for off loop. So I'm just going to say let counter equals 0, counter less than array.length, and then counter plus plus. And what this is doing is simply saying const element equals array at position counter. All right, so you see that there are no problems here. There are basically no complaints. If I were to console.log then element, this should work fine. If I save and come back here and run it, exactly we get the expected output. So there is no problem here. And what I'm doing in this, what I'm doing in this for loop is actually I'm assigning a new value, or I am redeclaring not redeclaring, but I am declaring a variable and assigning a new value to it every time I execute the loop. And that's fine, it's no problem. Of course, if I were to declare this function outside of the loop, I would have to declare it with a let statement. And here within, I would do something like this. And this is still fine. Although it's a bad practice, it's not going to cause the program to throw any errors. Now, the for off loop is actually doing this whole thing for us automatically when we use this shorthand here. So for const element of array, I can simply console.log the element, and this will output exactly the same thing. So it's a more concise structure, more concise construct. And if you want to use it, well, I use it quite often. I use it actually all the time whenever I have an array or an iterable more generally in JavaScript. I think it's easier to read and it's easier to understand as well. I also don't need to worry about the length of the array. I don't need to worry if I wrote the small than or small than equal or small or equal to. I don't need to worry about these checks of the for loop. I can ensure that with this construct, I'm going to iterate over all the elements of my iterable. That's it for off loops. Let's move now to while loops. And if you are familiar with for loops, you are already, based on what we discussed before, the while loops are just a shorter version of a for loop, right? So we're gonna have while some condition here, and we'll say true, and I'm gonna save this, and we can say console.log, I'm an infinite loop, right? Maybe let's try to run this. Probably things are gonna break. Here node while.js, and you see it keeps printing I'm an infinite loop because the condition never evaluates to false. I'm gonna try to kill this with Control C, and then this exits the program. That's how we would kill an infinite loop. So here, of course, the condition, I don't want to evaluate it to true, except, as I said, if I want my program to run continuously. So in the case of while loops, I need to maybe declare something, let's say should, or let's call this condition, and then the condition or counter here, it's also fine. Let's put a counter 0, while counter less than 5, console.log counter, that's no problem. Counter, and then we'll say counter plus plus, right? So the while loop really requires us to be aware of the initialization and of the update parts. While the for loop would bring all of this together in the loop declaration, when we use a while loop, we need to initialize the variables and to update the variables within the conditions separately. If I save this and I come back here, just execute it, again, no problem, expected output. So this is another construct that we can use to execute loops in JavaScript. While loop, check. And now let's briefly discuss do while. So do while is kind of the same as while. It's not really the same because it's another type of loop. But what do while is going to do is it's going to execute this block of code at least once, right? So here, let's say I will put a condition of false, and I'm gonna say console.log, I'll print at least once. So the do while loop is going to execute the code block first, and then it's going to check the condition, and if the condition is false, it's going to exit the loop. It's not going to execute it a second time, but it will always execute it once. If I clear here and I run a node do while, then you will see that it will print at least once. And if I were to do that with the while loop here, something like this, and then while false, I will not print, right? So if I save this and then I run node while, then nothing prints on the screen. So the do while loop, from my perspective, has some quite specific use cases. Maybe if you want to wait, or if you want to get the user input at least once before you actually check the condition, then this could be one solution, right? You can always simulate the same behavior in a while loop, but there is also this construct. And you can also come across this in other code bases that you're working with, so it's important you're familiar with it. One thing I forgot to mention, and perhaps we can use the for example here, are two keywords. So I forgot to mention two keywords here, the break keyword and the continue keyword, right? So these two keywords, they can be used to explicitly control the behavior of a loop. Remember, maybe I can come back here and clear the whole thing and run node for.js. And I have virtually no control over the behavior of the loop if I don't have any additional construct here. I could have a couple of if checks. So for example, if we could say if counter module 2 equals 0, so I want to print only the even numbers here exactly, then I'm gonna say console.log counter, right? If I save this, now I'm gonna print only the even numbers. So I'm adding a bit of control over how I actually execute the code. but I cannot, for example, exit earlier. If I wanted to print, for example, up until up until number 10, and I pass here number 20, there is no way that I could execute or that I could exit this loop earlier, except if I were to kind of start adding a couple of additional if checks, right? So if counter is less than 10, then I'm gonna do something, and then I'm gonna check if counter module 2 equals 0, then a console.log counter. So as you can see, if there are a couple of conditions that could happen within our loop, and we want to maybe skip the execution or exit from the loop early, then we would start to have to add all these checks. And actually, this is not going to prevent the loop from continuing. So it is going to continue the execution until 20, but it's going to actually not do anything if the counter is greater than or equal to 10. Now, if this condition was maybe a very large number, then this is going to take a while to execute, right? I mean, you see it's executing here, it's not doing anything, and it's executing. So the main event loop of JavaScript is blocked, and basically I cannot do anything if this loop is actually executing. So I'm gonna break out of the program with Ctrl+C. I'm gonna clear the whole thing. So the break and the continue keywords, they can be used to actually control this behavior, right? If I were to say if counter is greater or equal to 10, break, then you will see that now if I execute the loop like this, then it doesn't really matter which number I put here. As long as counter exceeds or is equal to 10, then I'm going to break out of the loop early, before the end of its execution. So if I save this and now I run node 4, you see that I exit early. I don't keep running and running and running forever. The continue is going to actually stop the execution of the current iteration and jump directly to the execution of the next iteration. So let's say here, instead of saying something like this, if counter module 2 equals 0, I'm going to actually put this console.log counter here at the bottom. And here I'll say if counter module 2 different than 0, I'll say continue. Right, so what's going to do is it's going to start the loop execution. It's going to check, okay, counter is equal to 0, so I'm not going to break out of the loop. Then it comes to this line, and then it checks, is the module 2 different than 0? No, 0 divided by 2 is 0 with the rest of 0. So it's not going to execute the continue statement, and then it's going to print here the counter. Then it comes to 1, and then it checks again, counter is 1, so it's not greater than nor equal to 10, so I'm not going to break out of the loop. And then I check, is counter module 2 different than 0? Yes, it is. The counter module 2 is 1, so I will continue the loop. I will simply stop the execution here. I'll cut the loop. I will execute the post execution command, and I will start fresh again. So everything that comes below this continue here will not be executed. If I save this, this is going to have exactly the same behavior as before, right? So these two keywords, they can be quite useful for us, and in controlling or having a little bit more fine-grained control over how the loop behaves, and not having to worry too much about whether we need to nest a lot of ifs and we need to worry about how many times this loop is going to be executed. Now, of course, this doesn't mean this is a good practice, right? But perhaps if we are in an infinite loop, let's say, and we want to break in under a certain condition, then this would be one way of doing that, right? So if the user, for example, provides a certain combination of keys, we want to execute, we want to break out of the loop and terminate the program, and this would be one way of doing it. That's it for today's video, and in the next video we'll talk about handling exceptions in JavaScript. And if you don't want to miss that, make sure to subscribe to the channel and you'll get a notification when the video is out. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye!